The nurse found the letter hidden beneath the old man's pillow just minutes after his heart monitor went silent. On the envelope, there were only 6 words written in shaky handwriting. "To my family, read this last." But what was inside that letter would force his children to question everything they believed about their father. Because for 30 years, they thought he was a stubborn old man who had nothing left to give. They thought he was a failure. They thought he had wasted his life. They were wrong. Very wrong. At 90 years old, Thomas Whitaker lay quietly in a small hospital room in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The rain tapped against the window as the machines around him slowly filled the room with soft beeping sounds. His hands were thin. His hair was completely white. His body had become fragile. But his eyes still carried something most people had forgotten about. Hope. For almost a week, doctors knew his time was running out. His daughter, Linda, visited every afternoon. But she never stayed long. She would sit in the corner, checking her phone, answering emails, and occasionally asking the same question. "Did you sign the papers yet, Dad?" Thomas looked at her with tired eyes. "What papers?" "The house papers. The property transfer." He slowly turned his head toward the window. The old farmhouse where he had lived for 48 years was the last thing he owned. And his children wanted to sell it before he was even gone. Linda sighed. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Thomas looked back at her. "Harder for who?" The room became silent. Linda looked away. Because deep down, she knew the answer. For years, Thomas Whitaker had been the person his family misunderstood the most. To everyone in Cedar Falls, he was just an old man who repaired broken machines in a small garage behind his house. People called him Tom the Fixer. A man who spent his life covered in oil stains, wearing the same brown jacket every winter. He never drove a luxury car. Never owned expensive watches. Never talked about money. And because of that, people assumed he didn't have any. Even his own family believed it. But Thomas wasn't always an old man fixing tractors in a small town. 40 years earlier, he was one of the most talented engineers in the Midwest. He had a mind that could solve problems most people couldn't even understand. In 1979, he worked at a manufacturing company outside Chicago. While others saw broken machines, Thomas saw possibilities. He designed a small improvement to factory equipment that saved the company millions of dollars. His boss told him something he never forgot. "Tom, people like you don't come around often." But then everything changed. His wife, Evelyn, became seriously ill. And Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He left his rising career behind. He moved back to Cedar Falls. He took care of Evelyn until her final day. He never told anyone about the opportunities he lost. He never complained. He simply said, "Some things are worth more than money." But after Evelyn died, something changed. His children remembered the sacrifice differently. They didn't see a loving husband who gave up everything. They saw a father who never became rich. A father who lived in an old house. A father who didn't give them the lifestyle they wanted. His son, Mark, became especially bitter. Mark was a successful real estate agent in Des Moines. He wore expensive suits, drove a new SUV, and often reminded people how hard he worked for his success. Whenever family gatherings happened, Mark would look around his father's old farmhouse and shake his head. "Dad, I don't understand you." Thomas would smile. "What don't you understand? You had talent. You could have been somebody." Thomas would look at him quietly. "Son, I was somebody." But Mark never understood. To him, success had a price tag. And Thomas never had one. The final argument happened 3 months before Thomas entered the hospital. The entire family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner. The table was filled with turkey, mashed potatoes, and old memories. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Until Mark brought up the farmhouse. Dad, you need to be realistic. Thomas looked up. About what? This place is worth a lot now. The land alone could make us all comfortable. Thomas placed his fork down. You mean you want to sell it? Mark leaned forward. I mean, we should stop pretending this house is some treasure. The room became quiet. Thomas looked around the table. His daughter Linda avoided eye contact. His youngest son, Daniel, stared at his plate. Then Mark said the words that changed everything. You spent your whole life protecting an old house. Maybe that's why you never had anything. Nobody spoke. Not even Thomas. He simply stood up, walked to his bedroom, and closed the door. That night, he pulled out a small wooden box from his closet. Inside were old photographs, letters, blueprints, and a document he had kept hidden for decades. He looked at the items and whispered, I guess it's time. The next morning, Thomas went to the local post office. He mailed one envelope. Not to a lawyer. Not to a bank. To his 3 children. And on the outside, he wrote, Open only after I am gone. Nobody knew what it contained. Not even Daniel, the son who still visited him every weekend. Days later, Thomas collapsed while working in his garage. A neighbor found him sitting on the floor beside an unfinished wooden chair. The neighbor called an ambulance. And that was how Thomas ended up in the hospital. Now, as his children waited for the inevitable, they argued about what would happen next. Linda wanted to sell the house quickly. Mark wanted to contact a developer. Daniel just wanted his father to wake up. Do you think he knew? Daniel asked. Mark looked confused. Knew what? That we were treating him like he didn't matter. Mark rolled his eyes. Daniel, don't start. But Daniel looked at his brother. No. Someone needs to say it. Before Mark could answer, a nurse walked into the room. She held a small envelope. Your father asked me to give this to you if he didn't make it. Everyone froze. Linda slowly took the envelope. The handwriting was familiar. Her father's handwriting. They sat together around the hospital room. For the first time in years, nobody was talking about money. Nobody was talking about the house. They were just a family. A broken family. Linda opened the letter. My children. If you are reading this, it means I have already left this world. I want you to know something before you make any decisions. The house was never the thing I was protecting. The memories were. She paused. Her voice started shaking. The letter continued. When your mother became sick, I was offered a position in California. It would have changed our lives. Bigger salary. Bigger house. More recognition. But I looked at your mother lying in that hospital bed, and I realized something. A person can always make more money. But they cannot make more time. Nobody spoke. The rain outside grew louder. Linda continued reading. I know you thought I failed because I didn't become wealthy. Maybe I did fail in some ways. Maybe I should have explained more. Maybe I should have shown you who I really was. But I never wanted my children to measure life by what they could buy. Mark shifted uncomfortably. Then came the part nobody expected. Before your mother passed away, I started working on an invention in my garage. Daniel looked up. What? Linda kept reading. I created a design that improved energy efficiency in industrial machines. I never sold it because I didn't care about becoming rich anymore. But 5 years ago, a company discovered my old research. The room went completely silent. The company offered to buy the patent rights. Linda looked at Mark. Even he seemed confused. How much? He whispered. She continued. The final agreement was worth $12.4 million. Nobody moved. Because suddenly, the man they thought had nothing had more than anyone imagined. But the next sentence hurt even more. I donated most of it. Mark's face changed. Donated? Linda kept reading. Over the last 5 years, I used the money to create the Whitaker Learning Foundation. Daniel covered his mouth. The Whitaker Learning Foundation was a small organization in Cedar Falls that provided scholarships and tools for students who wanted to study engineering. Everyone in town knew about it. But nobody knew Thomas was behind it. The letter continued. Every child who received help from that foundation reminded me of myself when I was young. Someone who had talent. Someone who needed a chance. Mark looked down. Because he remembered something. 10 years earlier, he had complained about a local teenager who was working at a grocery store instead of going to college. He had said, "Some people just don't have what it takes." Thomas had heard him. And now he understood why his father had looked disappointed. The letter continued. My children, I am not leaving you millions because I don't want money to become the reason you remember me. I am leaving you something more important. The truth. Linda wiped her tears. But there was one final page. One final message. If you ever wondered why I kept fixing broken things, it was because I learned something early. Broken things are not always useless. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them. Nobody in that hospital room could speak. Especially Mark. The man who spent years believing his father was a disappointment. The man who measured his father's worth by his bank account. The man who never asked what his father had sacrificed. 2 weeks later, Thomas Whitaker's funeral filled a small church in Cedar Falls. Hundreds of people came. Former students. Teachers. Neighbors. Engineers. Families who had received help from the foundation. Mark stood in the back of the church. He watched people talk about his father. Not about his money. Not about his invention. About his kindness. A young woman named Emily approached him after the service. Are you Thomas's son? Mark nodded. She smiled. Your father paid for my engineering program. Mark looked surprised. He did? She nodded. I lost my parents when I was 16. I thought my future was over. Your father told me something I'll never forget. Mark swallowed. What did he say? She smiled. He said, someone believed in me once. Now it's my turn. Those words stayed with Mark. Months later, the farmhouse was never sold. Instead, the family repaired it. The old garage where Thomas built inventions became a small community workshop for young people. And every year, Mark visited. Not because of the money. Not because of the inheritance. But because he finally understood the man his father had always been. One afternoon, Mark sat alone in the garage. He found the old wooden chair his father had been repairing the day he collapsed. On the bottom of the chair was a small handwritten note. Made for my son Mark. Because every person deserves a place to sit when they finally slow down. Mark held the note in his hands. And for the first time in years, he cried. Not because he lost his father. But because he finally found him. Sometimes the people we overlook are carrying the greatest stories. Sometimes the quiet person in the room has fought battles nobody ever saw. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance someone can leave behind isn't money. It's the proof that they spent their life making the world a little better than they found it.